Hi everyone, welcome back. This is our third session in the series on Balance Becomes Us. And I've called it Knowing, Not Knowing. So I'm going to start with a quote from one of my least favorite people, Donald Rumsfeld, because he is supposed to have originated one of my favorite quotes, which is this. He said, "There are known knowns, which are things that we know. There are known unknowns, which are the things we know we don't know. And lastly, there are unknown unknowns. And those are the things we don't know. So the last one can be particularly dangerous, but they can all be troublesome and they can all be advantageous. It actually depends how we look at them. So I'm bringing this up because there are different ways that we know things, how we know them, where we know them, why we know them. And I often think, do I know this from my head or my heart? Do I know this from my outside or my inside? Am I just surviving or am I thriving? And those are the questions that circulate around the idea of what we know. So one of the biggest questions we often ask ourselves are, who are we? That's a question best answered certainly from the heart, if we can answer it at all. So Eckhart Tolle gives a marvelous talk on not knowing who you are. And when asked that question, he said many people don't know how to answer. And he reminds us that if we are uncomfortable with not knowing, then we are most likely very comfortable with judging ourselves and others. Judgmental behavior is a way of creating a sense of security, not just about who you are, but about everything in your experience. And in your mind, those are the known knowns. They make us feel comfortable and safe. You might remember when we talked about the book Solve for Happy by Mo Gaudat, he talked about our blind spots, which are similar. And the two that he said are the most obvious are filters and assumptions. And so filters are beneficial in that they allow us to process information quickly, but they often leave things out. And it's simply because those are the ways we perceive the world in predetermined concepts. So it validates our existing view on things. Assumptions are brain-generated stories, but not necessarily the truth either. Assumptions are also an easy path to making sense of our world. We just don't have to try very hard. So these become our default settings. And filters and assumptions, like judgments, edit out the truth in order to validate our understanding of the world around us and make us feel knowledgeable, comfortable, and safe. But Eckhart Tolle also discusses that there are huge benefits in exploring unknown unknowns, especially about ourselves. So he quotes Socrates, who said, "I am the wisest of all men because I am the only man who knows that he knows nothing." So if you can become comfortable with not knowing, then you might begin to know yourself. We like unknowns, but only insofar as they are within our comfort range, such as when we travel, like taking a trip to Italy. Everything seems new, and we pay very close attention to the people, the food, the cars, the street signs, everything we take for granted in our normal home. So the idea is it's all very exciting, and that is why we travel. I love to travel. I totally miss traveling more than I miss restaurants, concerts, museums. And as soon as this is over, I'm going to plan my next trip. But I do understand that's why we travel, because these are an unknown that we feel safe and comfortable experiencing within that very limited sphere. So, but it's treading into the unknown of the heart. That could be a bridge too far for many of us. unless we choose to go there with purpose and intent. Acknowledging the unknown unknowns of who you are creates this wonderful space, because then you become a presence, letting go of judgments, assumption, and biases which tend to support the belief that you are always right, and as David Foster Wallace says, the center of the universe. True presence always entails a tremble of uncertainty and puts us in touch with vulnerability. Vulnerability can be the most disconcerting of all. And if you haven't watched or read any of Brené Brown's talks on vulnerability, I highly recommend them. And she says, we can choose courage or we can choose comfort, but we can't have both, not at the same time. Vulnerability is our greatest measure of courage. And while this often feels difficult, maybe even traumatic at first, it can open into an experience of vitality and aliveness that is incredibly meaningful. So this moving inside, this coming from the heart rather than the head, can become a source of strength and freedom to recognize what's real. You can know things through a presence that is deeper than consciousness. It's similar to the difference between being in a forest and knowing and naming the trees, or being in a forest and not naming the trees, but simply experiencing the presence of the forest, its aliveness. In Japan, they have a phrase for it. It's called forest bathing, which just sounds so magnificent. So it's similar to when we're enjoying ourselves, or we're in love, or we're creating artwork, or we're meditating. There is a wisdom that comes from the heart, not the head, from the inside, not the outside. And an understanding of that can facilitate thriving, not just surviving. David White, the Irish poet who I mentioned in the last class, he talks about the necessity of stopping the head talk in order to allow space to move into the heart talk. And he says, once you stop the first, the second comes naturally. I'm quoting him, he says, stopping the conversation on the outside is the necessity of holding a conversation with the unknown. So immediately when this outer peripheral active conversation is taken away from us, then that puts us into a relationship with the inside and the unknown. The great and difficult question is, what is my relationship to the unknown? Do I have any relationship with it at all in my active life? Or is it mostly just the outside involved with eliminating the unknown as much as possible? He says, and I agree, in judging things, I often think that as human beings, we're constantly naming things too early. For example, in a love relationship, we may name the love in there far too early before it's matured into the pilgrim destination that we didn't know we were setting off on. And I totally understand that, having been married for 30 years, because I had no idea that we would still be together, or how we would change and morph over these last 3 decades. So I was very careful not to name love, by the way. Obviously, of course, we need thoughts. We need to notice there's no food in the fridge, and we need to know we need to go to the grocery store. We need to know how to get there. We need to be able to formulate our thoughts in order to communicate and also understand others. But as we've been discussing in these sessions, it's all about balance. Using our thinking minds is our default setting. Joseph Goldstein, one of the founders of Mindfulness with Sharon Salzberg, has a wonderful quote about thoughts, and he goes, "They have so much power when we're not aware of our thinking, and how little power they have when we're aware. Thoughts are like little dictators, but we should remember they are little more than nothing. And it's our mindfulness practice that can bring awareness to our thoughts, from the inside and the outside, from the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. So with our practice, we can learn to be courageous, to go into the unknown unknown, and embrace it, Become familiar with it. Maybe even have it morph into some known knowns. We're just getting back in touch with our heart, our inside, our presence, where we can connect. And we can radiate that out to the people in the world around us. I do believe that our true nature is one of kindness, gratitude, joy, and compassion. And that brings a vulnerability. And that can be risky. And that's why we wrap ourselves in a blanket of judgments and filters and opinions, which allow us to artificially feel secure. So let's travel inside today, and let me suggest some concrete steps we can take to go into the unknown, to build our vulnerability and our courage. We can do small things at first, very similar to the way they teach overcoming a fear of snakes, little by little, step by step. So I would recommend almost any chapter from that wonderful book, How to Train a Wild Elephant. But start small. There's a couple, such as you don't use your dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, use your left hand. Or while eating, just eat. If you're feeling a little more courageous, she suggests you can try something called Say Yes, where you say yes to everyone and everything for one day. When you notice the impulse to disagree, consider whether it is really necessary. Could you just nod or be silent? This helps us to examine and potentially overcome our default judgments and filters. It helps us to see our personal opinion is not set in stone and is actually not that important. If you're feeling particularly brave, there's one other exercise, but we'd have to go there very carefully, especially in these times, and it's called Study Suffering, which is where you pay attention to the suffering in yourself and in others. Where is it most obvious? Notice the intensity of the suffering. There's a range from mild irritation to overwhelming grief. Also notice the difference between pain and suffering. Suffering is the mental and emotional distress that is added to initial pain. So when we notice it, when we bring awareness to it, this can help reduce the suffering. This exercise also engenders compassion in the same way that being sick helps us appreciate being healthy. I've created one for myself because I notice when I write a lot in my WhatsApp group or my text messages, I often start my sentences with I. So it's all about me. So I'm going to try this new exercise of not starting any sentences with I. So instead of I think or I want, I'm going to try, what if we do this? Or how about we try that? And if so-and-so were to happen, and we'll see how I get, because I realized I just ended up being so self-referential. So we're going to try and reword my sentences for a whole week and see how that goes. So over the next week, you may explore one of those exercises for yourself. And even though we don't go there too often, we can open our hearts, experience some compassion for ourselves as we go into these unknown unknowns, and experience that vulnerability and courage to bring a more vivid sense of aliveness to our days and nights. And as I always do, I'd like to leave you with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Joan Didion. She goes, "I'm not telling you to make the world better because I don't think that progress is necessarily part of the package. I'm just telling you to live in it, not just to endure it, not just to suffer it, not just to pass through it, but to live in it, to look at it, to try and get the picture, to live recklessly, to take chances, to make your own work and take pride in it, to seize the moment. And if you ask me why you should bother to do that, I could tell you that the grave is a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace, nor do they sing there or write or argue or see the tidal bore of the Amazon or touch their children. And that's what there is to do, and get it while you can, and good luck at it." So we might need some luck going into some of our more vulnerable, unknown unknowns. But the whole point is we won't know if we don't try. So thank you very much. And now we'll sit.